So great to see so many familiar faces and some new faces tonight. And on behalf of Asia Society Hong Kong Center, it's a great pleasure for me to welcome all of you to tonight's program. We're going to talk about a very interesting topic for Asia Society. As always, we try to bring you some of the best speakers, I think, around the world. And Asia Society Hong Kong has been very fortunate since we opened here February 2012 to bring you some wonderful speakers on really topics that have of great interest to you and to the community. So tonight's topic is U.S. foreign policy and the 2016 election. And we are very fortunate to have Mr. Ivo Daalder, President of Chicago Council on Global Affairs, with us to speak on this topic. And we also want to welcome the group from the Chicago Council on Global Affairs for being with us this evening. They've been here for a few days, and I know the Chicago and Hong Kong connection is very tight this year. And I think Business and Design Week, we're going to be focusing on Chicago in December. And personally, as a Kellogg HKUST alum, I'm very, very proud. In fact, we have a few of my fellow alum here today, because today, Financial Times, again, ranked the Kellogg's HKUST program as #1 in the world. And so allow me to brag. And we have Professor Zweig here from UST, so we do need to give it a plug. But also, besides Kellogg, those of you know that Chicago Booth is here, and they also have a wonderful EMBA program, and they have an office here. So the Ohio and I'm sorry, I'm giving away. I'm from Ohio, and the Chicago and Hong Kong connection is very strong, and we are very, very delighted to have somebody like Professor Daalder here to talk about this topic. The reason I talk about Ohio is because of the elections. So I apologize because I've been watching the election like all of us, and with great eagerness and hoping that it would be over soon. And I'm in less than a month, it will be over. And Professor Daalder said he's not going to talk about that. So I'm glad to hear that. He's going to talk about the U.S. foreign policy. And so that's something we're going to focus on. And I also, on behalf of Asia Society, I want to recognize our wonderful friends from the various consulates. Representative, we have tonight representative of consulate from Belgium, Kuwait, Netherlands, Austria, Bangladesh, France, Greece, Japan, Kuwait, Malaysia, Mongolia, Pakistan, Poland, and the U.S. Not a bad turnout. And of course, we, again, very proud to have our students represented. City University, Hong Kong Baptist, University of Hong Kong, Chinese University of Hong Kong, and HKUST. So always a pleasure for us to have students here to hear topics like this and to really meet speakers like Professor Daalder. So, and already last week when Richard Bush was here, gave you a big plug, and I think Professor Richard Bush was here speaking last week. I think working with you at the in Washington. And so we're very delighted to really welcome Professor Daalder. He has been the president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs since 2013. And prior to joining the council, he has served as ambassador to NATO. And so he has also served between 1995 and 1997 as the National Security Council staff as Director for European Affairs. Ambassador Daalder is a co-author of In the Shadow of the Oval Office, Profiles of the National Security Advisors and the President They Served, from JFK to George W. Bush. And it is really my great honor and great pleasure to welcome Professor Ivo Daalder.
Well, thank you for that very kind introduction, and it's great to be here in Hong Kong to talk about American foreign policy and the elections. I don't want to talk about the elections. I'm sick and tired of the elections. So I'm going to talk about American foreign policy. But before I do, just a word. Anybody observing the United States, and frankly from here or anywhere else in the world, or frankly even from the United States, must think that we've gone collectively mad. We may have. And we'll see how mad, in fact, we have collectively gone. But I want to start off with some good news. Chicago Council on Global Affairs has been doing public opinion polling for more than 40 years to try to figure out what Americans think about America's role in the world. And we just released the results of our latest opinion poll conducted in June, a sample of 2,000, more than 2,000 people. And there is remarkably good news in there. If you were to think and listen to the debate that is going on, you would think that Americans are about ready to jump off the world, that they want to retreat. We have one candidate who talks about building walls and putting America first. We have another candidate who spends 4 years trying to understand how important it is for the United States to engage in Asia and other places of the world, and only to declare that a trade agreement with Asia is not a good idea. We have a president who spent the last 8 years trying to end America's involvement in the Middle East and trying to minimize as much as possible our involvement in many parts of the world, all under the assumption that the Americans want to retreat from the world. So do they? And the good news is the answer is no. One of the questions we've asked for 40 years is, do you think that the United States should play an active role in world affairs or rather stay out of world affairs? And by a margin of 2 to 1, 64 to 35%, Americans think we should have an active role in world affairs. And that's a margin that is more or less the same as it has been for the past 40 years. So in that fundamental measure of how much Americans want to be engaged in the world, you can see there is hope for the future. But even if you dig a little deeper and ask the question on how do you think the United States should conduct itself in the world when it comes to the issues of trade or alliances or the importance of negotiating international agreements, Americans today are frankly no different than they have been for many, many years. Just to give you some specific numbers, 89% of Americans, 9 in 10 of Americans, believe that alliances, military alliances that the United States have had, are either somewhat or very effective way to achieve American foreign policy goals. And when you dig a little deeper and ask about specific alliances or specific arrangements, the numbers are the same. 75% of Americans think that the United States should either maintain or increase its commitment to NATO. Indeed, 60% of core Trump supporters, people who prefer Trump not just in the election today, but prefer Trump of all candidates that were running in both the primaries and are now running for the presidency, 60% of Trump supporters think that the United States should either maintain or increase its commitment to NATO. As to bases and the military engagement here in Asia, 60% of Americans think that the United States should maintain its military bases in Japan. Frankly, it's more than Japanese do. And 70%, highest percentage we've had so far, believe that the United States should maintain its military bases in South Korea. Similarly on trade, you wouldn't know it if you listened to the candidates, but 65% of Americans think that globalization has basically been a good thing for the United States. And when you ask whether trade is a good thing with regard to their consumer prices, to themselves, whether it's been good for the American economy writ large, 60, 70% of Americans think that that trade has been positive on those measures. One thing that Americans don't think trade has been good is on jobs and job security. And that is indeed one of the issues that Donald Trump has seized a hold of. Even on TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which all of you know about, 60% of Americans think that we should ratify the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. You wouldn't know it if you listened to the candidates, but that's where the Americans are. And when it comes to negotiating treaties, 71% of the American public believe that the Paris Agreement on climate change was a good idea. 60% of the American public believe that the Iran nuclear agreement was a good idea. So whether you talk about trade or alliances or globalization or the United Nations or international agreements, all the kinds of things that have mattered for the United States in its engagement in the world for the past 70 years, the American public basically thinks that how we have engaged the world is more or less like how how we should be engaging the world. So the public isn't the issue. The issue is what are the politicians, the presidents, the people who get elected going to do. And that's what I want to spend the next 20 or so minutes talking about. I want to talk about whomever is going to be president on January 20th, 2016, what is it that they will find? What's the world look like after the inauguration and after the parade, and they walk in the Oval Office for the first time and they she opens up the drawer and reads the letter from President Obama, as presidents do, and then sits down and thinks about what does this world look like. And frankly, that world, if you think the American public's views on engagement are the good news, the world as it will look like at that point is probably the not so good news. In the Middle East, which has dominated American foreign policy thinking for the last 15 years, we find a region that is in a deep historical crisis. In a crisis, frankly, we haven't seen any region in the world for at least 70 years. It's a region that is marked with at least four failed states: Iraq, Syria, Libya, and Yemen, and has 5 insurgencies or civil wars, those 4 states and an insurgency in Turkey that is weakening that society as well. It is a region that has a tremendous growth in its young population, particularly young men, none of whom have much of an economic future, all of whom, as young men, would like to find young women, but there aren't enough of them, and are trying to find out where their future is and looking at the future and not finding much of hope. You have a region in general economic decline. Saudi Arabia that is suffering under low oil prices, in Iran that has suffered for decades under sanctions and mismanagement, in Egypt that is an economic basket case that is difficult to describe, and growing in population size more rapidly than any other part of the region without finding much hope. You, of course, have a division between Shias and Sunnis, now personified or made real by the conflict between a Saudi-led Gulf and Iran, that is deeply dividing societies throughout the entire region. And all of this, if you add it all together, lack of governance, lack of economic opportunity, a youth bulge, failed states, civil wars, Shia-Sunni division is feeding extremism and fundamentalism. It is feeding terrorism and the growth of the ISIS movement. It is creating a crisis of governance that we have frankly not seen in any part of the world for a very long time. And of course, it has created a massive refugee and internally displaced movement. 20 million people in this region alone, 1/3 of the total refugee population in the world, comes from the Middle East. More than 10 million are displaced either internally or made refugee from Syria, which represents about half of its population. So that's one part of the world that the president faces on January 20, 2017. And there may be something that happens between now and then, but none of it is going to be to make this picture look any better. What about this region, the region where we are here in Asia? The next president is going to face at least 3 very big challenges. The first and most important challenge, the challenge that has been, frankly, here for the region and for the United States and everyone in the region, is how to accommodate China's rise. What does one do about a country that is rapidly increasing its power, economic, military, and political, as rapidly as this country has, by a degree and at a space that is, frankly, unmatched in history? How do we deal with that? How does China deal with its own internal challenges because of that rise? And the challenges are real. They are about the economic reforms and transformation that is necessary for the society to continue to grow and succeed. There are the social and political challenges that come with a growth rate and a change that has affected the society over the past 30 years in ways that we have never seen before. And there are the environmental crises, not only of pollution in the air, but pollution of the soil and everything that rapid economic progress has created. And then there are the external challenges. The decision by the Chinese government on how it is going to deal with all of its neighbors, and I mean all of its neighbors. All of those decisions are frankly up in the air. No one really knows, certainly not on the outside, and for some probably not on the inside, of how is China going to relate to Japan and over the issues that are confronted in the East China Sea, or how it is going to relate to its partners here in the South China Sea, and whether it is going to try to dominate that region militarily and geopolitically, or whether it is going to try to find a way to accommodate the interests that countries have around the world. How is it going to deal with South Asia, with India? And so if you go around to periphery, you have to ask the question, how is it going to deal with the challenges that it faces? And how, most importantly and relatedly, is it going to deal with the question of the United States? Is it going to try to have a relationship with the United States that is cooperative both regionally and globally, or is it one that is a relationship of confrontation? It's a great uncertainty. The United States will have a vote in this effort, but China has a major voice. And how that issue gets dealt with in the next few years and indeed decades is the most important issue facing the United States in this part of the world. The second major challenge is, in fact, defining the U.S. role in the Pacific. What is the U.S. role? What should the United States do, given the complexity of the region? In many ways, we had a decade of neglect in the 2000s, where the United States, so preoccupied with the post-9/11 world in Iraq and Afghanistan, neglected to really invest in Asia. The next president, President Obama, tried to reverse that through the pivot or the rebalance, but there is still a growing uncertainty about the implementation of the pivot and the rebalance and how serious one should take that. The decision by not only Donald Trump but Hillary Clinton to oppose TPP cast serious doubts about America's relationship to many of its friends and partners here in Asia on not only the economic side, but on the security side. On issue after issue, the United States has at times been outplayed by China. Take the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, where the United States not only opposed the creation of the bank, but found itself on the outside when everybody else was on the inside. In that, rather than finding a cooperative means to deal with that, trying to do it in a confrontational way. And we find most countries in the region, other than our key allies in Korea and Japan, hedging with regard to whether the future lies with China or with the United States, in part because the United States hasn't clearly defined its role. And then, of course, the third major challenge is North Korea. In the next 3 to 5 years, North Korea will, if intelligence reports are to be believed, acquire the capacity to deliver a nuclear weapon on the United States. No president, no matter who she or he is, can live with that possibility without serious consideration of its consequences. In my view, this is going to be the number one crisis facing the United States in the next presidency, no matter, again, who is president. And how to deal with that is, again, going to raise real questions. It is a question of how we address our relationship with Korea, with Japan, and indeed with China, and whether we can come up with a a policy with regard to North Korea that pulls everyone together in an effort to deal with this threat, or whether, in fact, it's going to divide us, both from our allies and potentially from China, on how to deal with that issue. So these are big challenges in Asia. Finally, the next president will face the challenge of what is happening in Europe. In many ways, the next president is confronting a Europe that is facing the biggest crisis in its own history over the last 60 years, where fundamentally the future of Europe as it has existed for the past 60 years is in doubt. Whether Europe as an economic entity, as a political entity, will continue to be able to deal with the challenges in cooperation as it has for the past 60 years, or whether it increasingly will divide. And then it is dealing with a Russia that really for the first 30 plus years is engaged in a relationship with the United States that is fundamentally antagonistic and uncooperative on every single measure that you want to take, whether it is what's happening in Eastern Europe and Ukraine, whether it's happening with regard to NATO and the question of the relationship between the alliance and Russia, whether it is in Syria or whether it is in Egypt, where today there are 5,000 Russian paratroopers conducting exercises, whether it is in cyberspace, where for the first time, at least as far as we know, the first time the Russians have directly interfered in the elections in the United States, as they have directly interfered in the political process in much of Eastern and Central Europe for many years. A Russia that is gone, I think that's the only way to put it, rogue when it comes to its behavior with regard to the rest of the world. You have a Russia that is challenging Europe, and you have a Europe that is trying to figure out how to deal with its own internal crises. Crises brought about by the economic crisis of 2007 and 8, which is still reverberating through much of the European economy, particularly in the South. A crisis that is fed by a growing migration and refugee flow that didn't stop in 2016. It just has shifted south. There are now more migrants coming into Italy today, in this year, than there have been in 2015 coming into Italy last year. Because the flow has stopped into Greece, people aren't paying as much attention to it, but the reality is hundreds of thousands of people are still streaming into Europe, and Europe has no response to this. It is basically telling the Italians, your problem, not ours. And when they come to Spain, it will be Spain's problem, not anybody else's. Add to that the vote in Great Britain on June 23rd to leave the European Union, and you have an EU that is asking the question, what are we trying to do? Why are we here? And what are the consequences of what is happening economically, in terms of refugees, in terms of security, the terrorist incidents that took place last year, and the threat that continues till this day, is leading to the basic question: should we not close our borders and think about our security, our economy, our future in a national rather than in a European way? That's new. The renationalization of European politics is something that many growing up in Europe had thought was a part of the past. Then I won't even talk about the rest of the world, whether it's Africa or the Western Hemisphere, and the global issues from climate change to the rise of non-communicable diseases to the slowdown in globalization and the continuing threat of terrorism that will confront the next president. But if anybody looking at this picture of the world thought it was a good idea to be president of the United States, perhaps they should think again. Unfortunately, by January 2017, that won't be possible anymore. So given this huge agenda, what is a president to do? What is the response to this challenge? And here, and I'll end with that, I'll express my fear of what the response is and my hope. My fear is that the next president will do what the last two presidents have done, which is to focus on the Middle East and to say that this is such an immediate crisis that has so absorbed what is happening. And if you look at the election campaign and what we talk about in our debates, to the extent we talk about anything policy-wise, once in a while we do, it's about Syria, or it's about ISIS, or it's about terrorism. That's what we talk about. And the natural temptation for any president is to take what is in front of you, the urgent, the immediate, and take that as the top of your inbox and spend time on that. And indeed, if you ask the National Security Council, when you do all your meetings and you tally it up, how many of those meetings that the president is involved in and the Secretary of State is involved in, and a National Security Advisor involved in, that is focused on foreign and national security policy, how many of those meetings deal with the Middle East? The answer is about 75%. About 75% of the president's time, when he thinks about foreign policy, deals with the Middle East. One of the problems that presidents have is that there's one reality that they can't change. There are only 24 hours in a day. And any hour you spend on one thing is an hour not spent on something else. And when you spend 75% of your foreign policy time on the Middle East, it means you have 25% for the rest of the world. And the reason why they're spending 75% of their time on the Middle East is because the problem in the Middle East is not one that we can solve. Which is why we're spending so much time on it, because you have another meeting, let's have another meeting focused on how we can deal with the problem in the Middle East. The reality is that this crisis, which is truly historic, is a crisis that can only be resolved by the people in the region, not by people on the outside. And the more we try to make it our own, the more, in fact, we fail in doing so. The Sunni-Shia conflict, which is at the core of much of what's going on, is a conflict that has to be resolved by the Sunnis and Shias themselves. It can't be resolved by the United States or by anybody else from the outside. The demand for reform, economic, political, social, that exists throughout much of the Middle East needs to be met internally, not externally. The United States can't change the way that Egypt is governed. We tried, didn't work. Can't change the way that Iraq is governed. Tried, didn't work. And so these are issues that have to be addressed internally. We have to understand that we're pretty good at removing regimes. We're pretty lousy at dealing with the aftermath. In fact, we don't know how to deal with the aftermath. We neither have the power, and we certainly don't have the stamina to deal with the aftermath. And as a result, we can spend a lot of time thinking about what we need to do in the Middle East, but the reality is that we actually have a few core interests in this area that we should focus on. We want Iran to remain a non-nuclear power. We want to make sure that there's freedom of navigation so that the oil that tends to be consumed in this part of the world is freely available for you to consume, and even for the United States to consume, since we still import quite a bit. We want to make sure that terrorist threats that are true threats to the homeland are dealt with. We do want to stand by Israel, a historic relationship, particularly so long as Israel is still committed to both democracy and a peace process based on two states. So we have interests, but they aren't necessarily the most important interest. Instead, I think the next president of the United States should flip the 75-25 percentage of attention that it now pays to the Middle East and start paying that attention first of all to Asia and secondly to Europe, for all the reasons that I mentioned, the crises and the challenges that we face. In Asia, the next president, Xi, will have to figure out how to get TPP ratified. The walking away from TPP was a political decision that has grave consequences for our ability to continue to pursue our policy in Asia. So it will be important to find some way to rapidly get TPP ratified and implemented. It is important to continue to engage China, to find those areas of common ground, as we did on climate change, in order and to find, as best as we can, a relationship with China that makes clear that we want China to, as Bob Zoellick called it many years ago, be a responsible stakeholder in international order. But we can only have a China that is a responsible stakeholder in international order if it continues to behave or behaves in ways that make that international order both secure and stable. And that requires it accepting some key norms and key ways in which we deal with the rest of the world. It includes accepting judgments by international courts when it comes to the question of how to resolve the issues in the South China Sea. It includes the understanding that we will defend our allies, and we will do so with the means we believe are necessary to defend those allies. And when those allies are threatened by nuclear missiles from North Korea, we're going to put on the territory, with their consent, the kinds of capabilities to try to defend those countries from nuclear missiles coming from North Korea. That will have to be an important part of what we, the United States, do as part of that. We will also find other ways, necessarily need to find other ways to strengthen regional cooperation, not as a means to balance China, but as a means to enhance security and prosperity of the entire region, including by having increased cooperation with our friends and partners here in Southeast Asia. And we need a new direction with regard to North Korea, a direction that makes it clear that we are prepared to have unconditional negotiations with them on the nuclear issue, and frankly on anything else they want to talk about, but that we will have those unconditional negotiations only if it leads, in the end, to an acceptable conclusion. We will want China to be part of that. We want everybody to be part of that. We want to open the door to those conversations. But if they don't work, then we also have to be clear that there may well be other ways in which we have to deal with the threat that North Korea poses and to the region today and soon to the United States itself. Asia will have to be on the top of the agenda because Asia, as President Obama has recognized, and many others, is the most important strategic region, geostrategically, geoeconomically, for the United States. But we also have, and I'll end with that, an interest in making sure that the United States remains not only an Asia-Pacific power, but a European power. Power that recognizes that Russia is, at the moment, engaged in the kind of behavior that is unacceptable, that needs to be contained through firmness and patience, by bolstering our alliances in Europe, including in NATO, by helping those countries that are not yet in NATO to reach their full potential, whether it's in Ukraine or in Georgia, as strong partners of the United States and of the NATO countries, to maintain sanctions and, where necessary, to increase sanctions on Russia so long as it continues to occupy countries and parts of countries that are not its own, and to help the European Union in as best a way possible to continue a path of cooperation rather than division by helping them to deal with some of the challenges that they face. That's a tall agenda for the United States, but it's an important agenda. If the United States, if the next president is to behave in ways consistent with how American public seems to think we should behave, which is a way that keeps an open, tolerant view towards the world, where borders are open, where trade is encouraged, where alliances and security relationships remain strong. Then you need a foreign policy that puts Asia and Europe up front, that deals with the crisis of the Middle East as best one can, but not let it overwhelm us. It's the reality that for the last 70 years, since 1941, the United States has been both a Pacific and a European power, and it doesn't have to, it doesn't need to, and it doesn't have at this point in time. It wouldn't make the right decisions if it decided at this point in time that it was to be neither a European nor a Pacific power, but just an America First power. That is not the kind of United States the rest of the world needs or wants, and it's certainly not the kind of United States foreign policy that the United States should pursue if or when the next president takes office. Happy to take some questions, but thank you very much.
And questions from the audience? Professor Swite?
Actually, have two, but maybe I'll. Is it okay if I ask? Well,
you can ask two, and I'll answer none.
That's fine. Well, the first thing was you implied, I thought, that if Israel did not maintain a policy of supporting a two-state solution, that the United States should not maintain its close relationship with it. That was the implication. So I would wonder about that. But the second question for the region was that as you laid out what China needed to do, and I think that most people would agree with you that China needs to decide what kind of relationship it wants to have and wants to have with the United States. I didn't hear you say anything about what the United States needed to do to accommodate China's rise. It sounded very much like China was rising, and China had to figure out how to do that. Now, clearly that is a big problem for China, but if you're saying what the next president should do, I didn't hear that and was a little surprised.
So on the issue of Israel, I believe that Israel's security is a fundamental national interest of the United States, but our ability to help it secure itself depends on how Israel behaves itself as well. It's not just about the external threat; it's also by how it deals with the relationship. I believe that the United States, in policy since at least 1967, so continues to be the policy of the United States, that the ability of the United States to work to make Israel's security a high priority in its national security depends on Israel's willingness of engaging in a process that ultimately leads to a two-state solution. And I think that's a policy of the United States for a very, very long time. I also argued that Israel, that as long as it's committed to democracy, which you take those two things together, it tells you what kind of policy Israel ought to be pursuing, and frankly, that's the policy that most Israelis would like to pursue, and certainly all Americans would agree with. With regard to what the United States should do with regard to China's rise, I mean, the reality is China is rising. It's something the United States not only has accepted but welcomes and should welcome. And the idea that we should try to figure out a way to stop this is both impossible and, frankly, counterproductive. At the same time, I think it is very important for the United States to work with China to define what are the areas where we can agree and work together, and how can we expand those areas. So I mentioned that the kinds of relationship we build up with China on the issue of climate change is the kind of way you try to engage the country in order to find other ways we can address the challenges we face together. At the same time, there are certain areas where I think it is probably a good idea to demonstrate and be clear that there may be differences between our approach. As the president said, 2 years ago when he was in Japan. Our view with regard to our continued defense of Japanese territorial sovereignty and security is absolute. So that dispute they may have about that island in the East China Sea, we would like them to figure out how to resolve that peacefully. But if they don't do it peacefully, there are going to be consequences. I think with regard to South China Sea, China's view of its territorial claims are not accepted internationally, including by the ruling of the International Court. And we should continue to insist that it does accept the ruling of the International Court. So there are areas where we may disagree, and on those disagreements we should be firm, not because we want to stop China's rise, but because we want to have a China that accepts the same kind of norms and institutions that are important for the maintenance of international order. And I think in order to try to maintain an engagement on the one hand, we have sometimes perhaps not been as firm as we should with regard to drawing the lines on the other. And I think out of ambiguity, one tends to get conflict, sometimes more than out of a lack of ambiguity. I do think one of the big test cases in our relationship is going to be North Korea. We have a very different interest on how to resolve North Korea, where our interest is to try to do whatever we can to prevent a nuclear threat from emerging to the United States itself. And China's number one interest is to avoid the collapse of the North Korean state. Well, we got to figure out a way to overcome that, because those two may not necessarily lead one in the same direction policy-wise. So I think when it comes to the next big challenge, it's not the South China Sea, it's probably North Korea policy, where you have to decide to what extent are we going to engage with China in order to decide the rules together, which is the preferable way of dealing with it, and at what point are we going to diverge, and what are the consequences of that divergence.
In my opening remark, I forgot to acknowledge two guests, and one of them is the new Consul General from Canada, and then the other one is the Deputy Mayor of Chicago, and Steve Coate. Welcome, and I just wanted to add that. And this kind of leads me to a question that I have is, if you heard the last two presidential debates, Chicago got brought up quite a bit, and about crime, which I'm sure you can address that. But one of the questions I have for you is, when she takes office January 20th, 2017, what is the balance between the domestic issues and the foreign affairs? I know today we've been talking about the foreign affairs issues, but there are issues in that domestic issues. So what do you think is how she's going to spend her time?
Well, all presidents spend the vast majority of their time on domestic politics and domestic issues, the economy, first and foremost, because it is, after all, Americans. Sorry for those of you who are not Americans. It is, after all, Americans who get to elect the President of the United States. And as a result, there is a natural, it's natural for any leader to focus first and foremost at home, and it's not like we don't have any problems at home. In fact, both candidates have agreed on the importance of infrastructure investment, which anyone who's flown in or driven across the United States knows is needed. There is an agenda for tax reform. Apparently, since you can make billions of dollars and not pay federal taxes, we probably should reform the tax system in order to make sure that doesn't happen in the future. And I think there's an agreement on that as well. Whether we can get a political agreement through both houses of Congress is a different question. We had a major healthcare debate and a major healthcare reform in the United States, and there are changes needed there, and on so many other issues, the next president will have to pay a lot of attention to that. When she is elected, she is likely to find a political situation, both in the Congress and generally in the country, that is not necessarily conducive to bold reform of the kind that many of us think is necessary. And as a result, as happens with all presidents, the freedom to maneuver on the international front is larger, and while you will spend most of your time still on domestic politics, I would think that she would want to spend some time on foreign policy, in particular, given the fact that she, as Secretary of State for 4 years, has a natural interest in doing so, and there's a crying need for doing so.
Questions? We have some back there.
Hi, so thank you. Can I ask you, just extend on the first question that was by the professor. So given, how do you think the United States can make other states, not just China, but including, to abide with international regulations or international institutions and norms when the rest of the world actually argues whether the United States itself abides to the international norms and institutions?
That's a good question. I mean, in those areas where the United States may not be doing so, I think it's fair to raise those, be interested in the specifics of that. In the question of the South China Sea, there was a ruling by the International Court. It was pretty clear, pretty evident. We haven't heard yet from Beijing what its views on that are. Certainly, we haven't seen any behavior that says that it accepts it. It is probably right for the United States and, frankly, for other countries to continue to insist that those rulings be abided by. International politics is always subject not only to the rule of law, but, frankly, power matters in international affairs. And I think the United States knows that. We try as a country to adhere as much to adhere to the not only the norms but the rules that we agree to internationally. For example, we adhere to the UN Law of the Sea, even though we haven't ratified it. We believe it's a fundamental part of how one thinks about issues of navigation, not unimportant for what's happening in the South China Sea. And it's important that we try to find as broad an international consensus to adhere to international norms and international rules. And the greater that consensus is, the more likely it is that countries will abide by it.
Over there.
So when I heard you said earlier, the U.S. is pretty good at removing regimes. I live in Asia and I'm Asian, so personally I hope that you don't think it's okay to remove regimes in Asia.
Oh, I don't think it's okay to remove regime. My point was that that just because the United States has in the past demonstrated an ability to invade and topple regimes, as we did in Iraq, doesn't mean we can guarantee a much better outcome for those countries. So, in fact, my argument would be you probably don't want to go down that path because the consequences are neither good, certainly not good for the country itself, and they're not good for U.S. interests.
So I have two questions.
Sure.
Well, you just asked one question.
You already asked one.
So that's three.
Statement.
Okay.
I said I hope you don't think it's okay
Well, but
to remove
we have to give
regimes.
other people an opportunity, so
Yeah.
you can make it quick.
One is you said earlier that you hope the new president would find some way to pass the TPP. I would like to know more how you think that can happen with the Congress still, the lower house being Republican. Second question is how you think U.S. with Japan waking up and forming alliance with Russia is going to find itself in the new Asia?
I'm not sure I understand the second question, so I'll answer the first.
Okay.
In the end, the only way we're going to get TPP ratified is with a Republican majority in Congress. My hope is that President Obama will, and the Republican leadership in the House and the Senate we'll be able to come to an agreement on ratifying TPP between the election and the inauguration of a new Congress. It's by far the easiest way to resolve this, because even if Clinton wins, I mean, under Trump, I don't have much hope of a ratification of TPP, or at least an agreement to ratify TPP. I think Clinton has made clear that the current agreement is not acceptable to her, so she would have to find some way to make it acceptable prior to ratification. So I think the best way to ratify it is to get it done immediately after the election and before the inauguration of a new president. It will be very tough, but I think the consequences of failing to ratify TPP for America's role in this part of the world will be significant.
Okay, David, and then the Consul General.
Great. Thank you for your remarks. I think a lot of Americans and non-Americans are wondering, how did Trump happen? And you're taking a step back, looking at Nigel Farage in Mississippi at a Trump rally. You see Brexit. You see what's happening around the world in a lot of places. There's a large percentage of the world that feels left behind. How does the next president, and I voted 3 weeks ago, hopefully for the next, or 2 weeks ago for the next president, how does the next president deal with those problems of the left behind, if you will, at home, as well as those abroad? Because you see that globally, you see that in Europe, obviously. And I think you see that to an extent in some parts of Asia, Hong Kong, potentially the Philippines in some respects, loss of identity, loss of self. How do you deal with the left behind, both domestically and abroad?
Well, it's the biggest question that I think we face in global politics today, because the phenomenon of Trump is just one part of a much larger, as you say, of a much larger trend in particularly in Western politics. I think what's happening in the Philippines, maybe even here, is it may not quite be the same thing, but at the very least, it is a belief on the part of a significant number of people. By the way, a significant minority in every country, but a significant number of people, that the forces of globalization and demographic change are changing the nature of the societies in which they live at such a rapid pace that their view of the future and their sense about the future is much less certain than it used to be. And the change is not just because of trade; it's actually technology, much more so, which is changing the way people think about work, the entire labor environment. The change is demographic, particularly in Europe and the United States, because of the rapidly changing nature of the makeup of societies. That is leaving and that is confronting a group of people with uncertainty, with anxiety about what the future holds. If you look at Trump supporters, for example, they're on average slightly more wealthy than the average American, than you would expect. So it's not necessarily even about their own economic standing, but it's about anxiety about their future economic standing, about their kids, about the future of what the economy has to offer. Trump, as it is in most of European societies, the anxiety translates, it's overwhelmingly white. And the old majority, in Europe still continued majority population that is anxious about a changing nature of what we look like. So these are identity questions. They're economic questions. They have to do with the future of employment and the way in which we're going to organize our societies, and they're pretty big. And we will have to have a national debate. They don't tend to get solved easily in politics, certainly not when it comes to elections. And this requires a national conversation and a national engagement that is probably beyond any particular election cycle, or certainly beyond any particular individual to address. But we're having a real debate. We're having a debate, as the economists put it, between open and closed. Whether we want open societies and open international systems, or closed societies and closed systems. And it's a pretty big debate. And we had it in Britain, and it led to Brexit. We had it in the United States, and it's led to Trump, and we're having it all over the place in our country. And to say it doesn't matter, or they're all crazy, or this doesn't make any sense, isn't going to solve the problem. We will have to take it very seriously, while also figuring out new ways to address those anxieties.
We have one last question. I'm going to reserve it for the Consul General from Canada.
Well, thank you very much, and I was touched to be specially acknowledged. And representing a country that is currently projecting an open, inclusive, pro-trade, welcoming kind of message, we have high hopes for the future. I'm grateful for your observations about TPP because I was interested to hear the scenarios for how that might get done in the future. But I wanted to ask, you mentioned with regard to Secretary Clinton, her foreign policy interest would be informed by her years as Secretary of State. And I just wondered if you had any observations about how she chose to spend her time and effort during those 4 years in that portion that was discretionary, and what that might tell us about particular areas of focus that she would bring to the foreign policy agenda should she be elected president. Thank you.
So that's an interesting question because in some ways she chose to spend her time on the issues that I think she should have spent time. She actually didn't spend a lot of time in the Middle East. It wasn't high on her agenda, partly because she had a special envoy to deal with the Middle East peace process, partly because the White House controlled a lot of that, whether it was Iraq or other places. I mean, she played a pretty big role in the Arab Spring, and of course on the issue of Libya. But her first trip was to Asia. She went to every ASEAN summit, and she spent a lot of time in this part of the world. She spent quite a bit of time in Europe, not as much as in Asia, rightly so. And she traveled all over the world. She put issues on the agenda that normally weren't necessarily on the agenda, particularly the issue of women and girl empowerment, which she feels deeply. And if you go around much of the world, empowering women is the single quickest way to deal with poverty and disease in much of Africa and other parts of the world in South Asia, and she championed those issues like none before. So in some sense, you could say that if you go by how she dealt with it in the past, she is likely to pursue a policy that is consistent with what I think the right priorities should be. That said, she wasn't president, and the urgency of that inbox and the reality of the immediate trying to always crowding out the important will affect her as, frankly, it has affected Barack Obama, who also didn't want to spend a lot of time in the Middle East when he was president. That's not why he became president. It's not what he thought was important. So the discipline to keep focus and to be getting up each morning and looking in the mirror and say, I am going to do what's important, not what's immediate, is very hard. It's very hard for anybody in anything we do in the daily lives. It's extraordinarily hard for presidents. And setting up, coming into office with the explicit desire to say, we're going to do what's important and let the immediate be dealt with as necessary by those who can deal with it is going to be the biggest challenge, I think, the next president of the United States faces.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to take the prerogative and ask you a last question because your comment just now led me to this question about the role of First Ladies. This last week or two, we saw a lot of a very famous Chicagoan being very powerful in her speeches. So what do you think is going to happen? The Obamas are both in their 50s. They're quite young still and has And in terms of what would you advise? I mean, I know they're not coming back to Chicago right away. I guess they're going to be living in Washington for because of their daughter's education. But what do you think will happen to? Well, what would you what would advise the Obamas?
They won't take my advice, so that's okay. I mean, they are younger than I am, which tells me a lot. I think they have a deep dedication to the country. There are issues that they have championed as president and first lady, whether it is health or racial justice or children, that I think will continue to define what they do from here on in. I think they are extraordinarily aware of the opportunity that exists of being a retired, no longer president and first lady. They have announced the creation of the Obama Center and the Obama Foundation, which will be based in Chicago. And the linchpin of all of it that they're going to do is going to be civic participation. We're going to look at how can they enhance civic participation in everything that happens. I think that's remarkable. I mean, we have the luxury in the United States of having extraordinary presidents who have done extraordinary work after they were president. Jimmy Carter left the presidency on January 20, 1981. He's still going strong, battled and survived brain cancer, and has done extraordinary things for the past 36 years. The same is true for George H.W. Bush, for Bill Clinton, and I think that Barack and Michelle Obama will continue to do us proud as Americans as they take on the next part of their journey.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And we're very, very delighted that the architects who built this building for us, Billy Sin and Todd William, are going to be building the Obama Center in Chicago. So I know hopefully we'll have an opportunity in the future to welcome maybe one or both of them here at Asia Society in Hong Kong in the future. But again, I want to thank you so much for your wonderful presentation, and I look forward to having you back maybe after the election and give us some more of your wisdom. But again, thank you all for being here, and thank you, Ivo, for being a wonderful speaker.